Thanks, Chris, for inviting us. The overview for our session today, I'm just going to say a few words about the social psychology of religion and prejudice, then turn it over to Marah, who's really the expert in the room on this topic. She kind of designed and conducted the 4 studies that she'll be sharing. Then we'll open it up for Q&A along the way. If you have a really quick question about a slide, I would say unmute and ask, but if you can hold your questions to the end, I think it'll be best that way. We're probably all familiar with Gordon Allport's kind of famous quote about the role of religion being paradoxical, or the role of religion and prejudice being paradoxical, that religion makes and unmake prejudice and prejudices. I've been studying psychology of religion and prejudice for over 20 years now, and several of you in this room are also experts in that topic. And you know, there's several dimensions of religiousness, and there's several ways of measuring religiousness. And so it seems like when you're measuring religiousness with variables that overlap with conservative political ideology, or even might overlap with some of the value violating or perceived value violations, then those dimensions of religiousness are going to correlate more strongly with prejudices. Christian nationalism is somewhat new on the scene, though if we think about it more broadly in terms of religious nationalism, we're seeing rises in religious nationalism in other countries around the world. So I think this work on Christian nationalism needs to be expanded also to Hindu nationalism and other forms of religious nationalism. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say much more about religion and prejudice, except to say when people internalize the values of religion that emphasize compassion and humility and recognition of differences, then religiousness can lead to more tolerance. And but when people internalize some of the values of religion that might be somewhat polarizing or specific to the religion in terms of value claims or worldview claims, then those components of religion could be related to intergroup prejudices. That's all I have to say in terms of introduction. Marah is 4th-year PhD student at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, completed a 2-year master's and came to us with excellent training from Northern Arizona University. And she's in the process of transitioning to postdoc, which I'll let her tell you about if she chooses to do so. Marah.
All right. Can everyone see the screen that I want you to? Yes. Okay. Excellent. All right. Thank you for the introduction. And yes, that is new news. I just accepted a postdoc offer this week. So I will be transitioning to the University of Washington as a postdoctoral research scholar in the psych department, which I'm so excited about. Okay. So without further ado, let's see. All right. So I wanted to present some work from Dr. Rowatt's lab that we conducted over the past couple of years, and hopefully is going to be new for some of you here. Okay, so to provide some context to this work, our lab was especially stricken by the divisive 2018 zero tolerance immigration policy. This policy took a strong stance on immigration and allowed for the separation of immigrant families, and sometimes even resulted in the detention of immigrant children in cage-like enclosures. And dialogue around this issue was also striking. So for example, some news outlets and politicians used dehumanizing language when referring to immigrants and refugees, using animal and insect-like analogs to describe them. And when questioned about this policy, Acting Attorney General Jeff Sessions responded to criticism with the following statement. I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government because God has ordained them for the purpose of order. And so by drawing on biblical references, Sessions here evoked what we believe is a Christian nationalist ideology. And so all of this led us to investigate how Christian nationalist ideology related to support for this immigration policy and related policies, and more broadly speaking, prejudice toward immigrants. So to start, what is Christian nationalism? So Dr. Rowatt already introduced this a little bit, but we do want to take special care to say that this is a broader phenomenon of religious nationalism, and just in the context we're studying it in, it's Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism is an ideology or cultural framework which idealizes Christianity's role in American civic life. And central to this belief system is the belief that America should be a Christian nation, and America has a special role in God's divine plan. And previous research shows that Christian nationalism is associated with a wide variety of political attitudes, such as support for gun rights, punitive action toward lawbreakers, and even greater tolerance toward racists. And we also want to take a quick moment to recognize that this term Christian nationalism might be confusing or misleading when taken at face value. So obviously being religious or Christian is not an issue, and neither is loving one's country. However, nationalism can be, and religious nationalism we suggest is something different as well. So nationalism has been referred to as a negative attachment to one's country, in contrast to patriotism, which is referred to as a positive attachment. And nationalism is distinct in that it involves downward social comparisons with ideas like my nation is better than whatever other comparison nation that you're comparing it to. And nationalism also draws more on coalitional thinking, emphasizing group boundaries and opening the door for greater group-based biases. And additionally, Christian nationalism is not just political affiliation or political orientation. In fact, almost all of the research on Christian nationalism controls for these dimensions to demonstrate that these results are going beyond just political conservatism itself. So we theorize that those higher in Christian nationalism would be more threat sensitive and endorse greater levels of intergroup threat perceptions. This is broadly consistent with intergroup threat theory, which suggests adherence to strong belief systems, among other psychological propensities, predisposes people to be more threat sensitive. And intergroup threat theory distinguishes between two types of threat: realistic threat, which is a threat to tangible resources like the economy, and symbolic threat, which is a threat to non-tangibles such as values or culture. And in Whitehead and Perry's 2020 book, Taking America Back for God, they suggest Christian nationalists endorse sacred boundaries of cultural purity, which when threatened can lead to an increase in prejudice. And based on this, we theorized valuing cultural purity may lead Christian nationalists to perceive immigrants as threats to their culture, such as threatening what it means to be an American, and lead to an increase in prejudice outcomes and related sociopolitical policies. And previous work shows that threat is an important mechanism through which different ideologies promote prejudice, and people who view immigrants as posing a greater threat to their economic or physical security, being realistic threat, or to their worldview or culture, being symbolic threat, are more likely to hold prejudiced attitudes towards them. And based on extant stereotypes of immigrants, we suggest these perceptions are likely. So all of this led us to make the following predictions. So Christian nationalism will be associated with greater perceived threat from immigrants. Christian nationalism will be associated with greater prejudice toward immigrants, including dehumanization and anti-immigration policies. And threat will explain the association between Christian nationalism and prejudice toward immigrants. And we approached these questions across 4 studies. So in study 1, we analyzed data from the PRRI Brookings 2016 Immigration Survey. This is a nationally representative survey of American adults, which specifically asked questions about immigration and social attitudes. And herein we examined the association between the belief that America is a Christian nation and negative immigrant stereotypes and attitudes toward a recent immigration policy. And we, like other studies before us studying Christian nationalism, controlled for some basic demographic covariates. So in study 1, we found that the belief that America is a Christian nation was positively associated with the stereotypic view that immigrants increase crime in local communities. And we also found the belief America is a Christian nation was positively associated with support for building the US-Mexico border wall. Further, these associations remain significant while controlling for religiosity, political orientation, race, age, and gender. And I'll show you the results here. So just a visual, again, the way that we conceptualized Christian nationalism based on available data in this data set was how people viewed America as a Christian nation, if it has never been, was in the past, but is no longer, or has always been. And then on the left panel, we see that, and across both panels, actually, the results are pretty consistent. We find the strongest difference between past and always beliefs contrasted with never. So people who endorse that America was a Christian nation or has always been a Christian nation showed a greater endorsement of the belief that immigrants increase local crime, and they showed greater support for building the US-Mexico border wall. So study one was limited in the measure of Christian nationalism, believing that the United States is or was in the past a Christian nation is part of Christian nationalism, but it misses out on some of the more key pieces of it, such as the United States has a special role in God's divine plan. So we sought to conceptually replicate study one findings using data from the 2017 Baylor Religion Survey, which asks these standard questions to measure Christian nationalism, which are 6 items. And I can talk more about those in the question and answer period later. And we also assessed not just a negative stereotype of immigrants, but also Muslim refugees here. So consistent with study one, we found the same trend. So participants higher in Christian nationalism showed greater endorsement of the stereotypic views that illegal immigrants from Mexico are mostly dangerous criminals. And they also showed greater endorsement of the belief that refugees from the Middle East pose a terrorist threat to the United States. And you can see the effect size for refugees is slightly larger, suggesting that the effect of Christian nationalism on that view is a little bit stronger than immigrants in the United States. And further, these associations both held when religious fundamentalism, religiosity, political orientation, race, gender, and age were included in the model. So a quick recap from studies 1 and 2. So Christian nationalism was positively associated with the endorsement of negative stereotypes about immigrants and refugees. And the stereotypes, however, importantly, the stereotypes we examined were inherently also assessing perceptions of threat. So being dangerous criminals or increasing local crime, posing terrorist threat, those are all examples of actually realistic types of threat. And so we really wanted to try to tease that apart in some of these subsequent studies where we collected original data. Furthermore, there are also other relevant covariates that we could not include in our models because of the use of secondary data. They just didn't ask some of the questions that would tap constructs of interest. And then finally, a remaining question is this actually like Christian nationalism doing the work, or is this just nationalism? So providing some further context and information about the Christian nationalism construct, we thought would be useful in these subsequent studies. So in study 3, we collected an original sample of MTurk workers sampled through cloud research in the spring of 2019. And we sought to examine the association between Christian nationalism and prejudice toward immigrants using an actual measure of prejudice. We used the thermometer item, which asks participants to report how they feel about a variety of groups, from 0 being cold to 100 being warm. And we also included validated measures of religious fundamentalism, nationalism, and social dominance orientation to see if these effects of Christian nationalism on immigrant attitudes held while controlling for these other well-known and established predictors of prejudice. So study 3 results. We first sought to address that question, what is Christian nationalism? Is Christian nationalism just religious fundamentalism plus nationalism? We specifically chose fundamentalism instead of religiosity, knowing that fundamentalism is often more associated with prejudice. And so we regressed those two on Christian nationalism and looked at the interaction effect, and together they accounted for 46.6% of the variance in Christian nationalism, and the interaction term was not significant. So all of this just suggests that over half the variance in Christian nationalism is not accounted for by non-religious nationalism or religious fundamentalism, and Christian nationalism is not merely a product of these other variables. So just providing a little bit more context to the Christian nationalism construct. And then, consistent with our hypotheses, we found that Christian nationalism was positively associated with attitudes toward immigrants, that being the thermometer. So people higher in Christian nationalism were viewed immigrants more coldly. And it was also positively associated with both classical and modern prejudices, which are multi-item measures of prejudice that we adapted for immigrants. Additionally, we ran all of these models controlling for covariates, including fundamentalism, social dominance orientation, et cetera. And these effects of Christian nationalism on prejudice toward immigrants were robust. And interestingly, we found that religiosity itself was uncorrelated with measures of prejudice toward immigrants. And so I think it's really interesting when we compare just basic self-report religiosity to Christian nationalism to see how, like what Dr. Rowatt mentioned at the beginning, how different dimensions of religion are really, like we really have to qualify our claims here and say it's specific manifestations or belief styles that are driving these effects and not just religiosity or religious affiliation themselves. So studies 1 through 3 showed consistent evidence that Christian nationalism is associated with stereotypic views of immigrants and greater levels of prejudice. However, some of these outcome measures were conflated with perceptions of threat, such as perceiving immigrants as dangerous. And so we didn't address that in study 3, so we sought to do that in study 4. So in study 4, we examined threat as a mechanism and dehumanization as an outcome of an example of prejudice, as well as attitudes toward 3 other relevant immigration-related policies. So in study 4, we collected another sample of MTurk workers in 2018, and we examined measures of dehumanization, intergroup threat, perceptions from immigrants, Christian nationalism, and attitudes toward 3 relevant immigrant-related policies at the time, being DACA, family separation of asylees, and family separation of people who are caught crossing the border illegally. So I'll quickly run through these results. Basically, our hypotheses were supported. So Christian nationalism was positively associated with dehumanization of immigrants, and this association was accounted for by greater levels of intergroup threat. And for those who might be wondering, typically intergroup threat, you separate into realistic and symbolic. However, they were so highly correlated that I couldn't add them into the same regression model. So like others who've worked in this space, we chose to collapse them and just look at intergroup threat more broadly. And then we also found that Christian nationalism was positively associated with attitudes toward DACA, such that they supported DACA less. And again, this was accounted for by greater levels of intergroup threat. Christian nationalism was positively associated with family separation of immigrants who were caught crossing the border illegally, again, accounted for by intergroup threat. And then finally, Christian nationalism was positively associated with family separation of asylum seekers, and which was accounted for by greater levels of intergroup threat. So to recap, Christian nationalism was positively associated with dehumanization of immigrants. Again, all of these models held while including relevant covariates. And Christian nationalism was positively associated with attitudes toward the 3 immigration policies that we examined, being DACA and support for separating immigrant families who were caught crossing the border illegally or who were seeking asylum. And like study 3, we examined how religiosity might contrast to Christian nationalism in these attitudes. And we found that religiosity itself was uncorrelated with dehumanization of immigrants, but it was related to immigration policy attitudes, though the associations were weaker for religiosity compared to Christian nationalism. So a quick summary of findings from these 4 studies. So Christian nationalism is a robust and strong predictor of prejudice toward immigrants and related policy attitudes. We demonstrated this across a variety of different measures of immigrant prejudice. And threat is a really important mechanism which explains the relationship between Christian nationalism and these attitudes. And finally, Christian nationalism was not merely a product of fundamentalism and nationalism, or was it just religiousness? And so I want to wrap up here by just introducing some remaining questions, future directions, some of which our lab is currently pursuing. Excuse me. All of these data were cross-sectional or correlational methods. So of course, we ran mediation models, which are causal models, but we weren't fully able to infer causality here. So subsequent studies, some of which like we have done, which you might be familiar with, need to unpack this threat and Christian nationalism association. And then I think a really important issue, which we might spend some time in the discussion portion talking about, is aren't most South or Central American immigrants Christian? And they are. And I think that provides even further support for that this isn't just religiousness or group affiliation driving these effects, that Christian nationalism is doing something different, and that we might even be tapping, even though the items don't explicitly tap ethno or racial phenomenon, Christian nationalism might be encompassing this ethno-religious nationalism dimension more broadly. And like Dr. Rowatt mentioned at the beginning, religious nationalism is likely a more general phenomenon that we're just looking at one example of in the United States here. So future work, and if you know anyone who's interested, I would love to collaborate to look at religious nationalism in other cultural contexts. And then finally, some of the work that I'm doing and I think is really important to this literature is disentangling authoritarianism and Christian nationalism. We did a little bit of this with religious fundamentalism, as Altmaier referred to religious fundamentalism as the religious form of right-wing authoritarianism. However, there are like many measurement issues, and I think that remains an open question still. And if you want to read more or see more details, we have published this work. So you can find those at these 2 publications here. And if you have any issues finding them, please feel free to contact Dr. Rowatt or I. And then finally, just want to end with a thank you to my research team, my PhD advisors, Drs. Joanne Sang and Wade Rowatt, and my collaborator, Dr. Michael Pasick. And with that, we'll start the Q&A or discussion period.